Good morning, everyone. The program will now start.
Good morning. It is wonderful to be here with all of you. My name is Carla Coppell. I'm the Managing Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security and a Vice Dean in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. I am honored to be here speaking with you about and moderating a panel about one of the worst tragedies in the world today, the conflict in Sudan. I am honored to have with me two extraordinary experts, Sudanese women leaders, to talk about the conflict and the crisis. And I'm going to turn to them in a minute, following just a couple of comments to have us better center and recognize the magnitude of a conflict which just passed its second year anniversary with no signs of abating or resolving, millions and millions displaced, incredible violence, including sexual violence, and actually a spreading conflict with renewed engagement and violence in the recent times. I think it's super important that we have this conversation now. It's a moment when we need to focus the world's attention on the crisis, and we need to think about solutions moving forward, both causes, things that are perpetuating the crisis, and solutions. With that, we're looking forward to having a really engaged and engaging conversation that will involve you. We'll start with an exchange with our two experts, Wala Mohammed and Maha Tambal, and then we will open it up both for some questions that were submitted in advance and then for some questions that we will take in real time. And so I really hope that you will stay engaged and engage with our speakers. With that, let me introduce our speakers and then we'll start our conversation among the three of us. Wala Mohammed is a Sudanese civil society activist and the founder of Hopes and Actions Foundation. She works independently as a researcher and a digital rights activist. And her research explores the impact of war and displacement, particularly on young Sudanese women. She works with the Women's Refugee Commission and the Global Refugee Youth Network. Maha Tambal is a senior program manager at DT Institute, and she's an international development practitioner who has expertise in human rights, governance, and democracy. She specializes in work on public international law, transitional justice, and countering violent extremism. Thank you both so much for taking the time to be with us today. We really, really value having you here and the opportunity to spotlight your expertise. With that, I want to turn first to you, Wala. You've done this research, you're undertaking this research, and you're working closely with displaced Sudanese women. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges they face currently to their safety, their psychosocial well-being, and to the resilience of their communities writ large?
Thanks, Carla. Yes, as part of the research, we conducted several interviews with women in different displaced areas, such as Uganda, Chad, Egypt, and also West Kordofan in Sudan. And a threat of insecurity runs deeply through the narratives of these young women. While some find relative safety from direct conflict in their displacement area, they still lack the basic necessities in West Kordofan, for instance, such as shelter and basic food items and even security. West Kordofan is still among the areas that armed groups are still fighting among in these areas. And that's particularly worrying for them. There are also direct threats and harassment reported in camps in Chad, particularly, and the fear that shadows women even during essential tasks such as collecting water and firewood, which also tell us about how they face risk during their day-to-day life. However, at night, they also cited the, that the camps are dark. They don't have enough lights at night, which even inflict fear um, for them to move from one area to another. Um, Another particular security or safety risk for these women, young women in Egypt, for instance, is the anxiety of deportation due to the recent asylum law passed by the Egyptian parliament, which gives the government more authorities than the UNHCR to grant these refugees asylum status or papers. This particularly also affected their psychological well-being. The trauma they carry is also immense because of loss of loved ones, their homes, their livelihoods. This is a constant companion to them, I believe. And also the fractured family structures, the death and separations leave deep scars within these young women. Um, they also grapple with the discomfort and anxiety of their displacement environments and the security concerns that I mentioned. Some of them also kind of fearing, particularly the survivors of gender-based violence, um, they fearing developing particular disease because of the assaults they are exposed to, and that also add to their mental status, and because of the largely or starkly unmet needs in their location. And of course, despite all these challenges, threats of resilience do emerge through they are often strained, and there are also small informal networks that might kind of respond to the needs, but of course they cannot meet the needs of the bigger or the larger displaced communities. And these communities actually emerge, these local communities emerge to respond to basic necessities, particularly when the formal aids falls short. With recent fund cuts, the US fund cuts particularly affected these communities. However, these initiatives is also cited as irregular because of also how they are self-funded and self-dependent. Um, yeah, that's mainly the current situation.
I really appreciate you relaying this primary research that you're doing with people in different that are in different places as refugees, and it's interesting to see that there really are differences in what the harms are that different communities are facing around the region. Are there differences in terms of the coping mechanisms and strategies, the levels of grassroots support? Tell us a little bit about, how those are differentiated and where the gaps reflect different needs and different strategies in different parts, in different refugee communities.
Yeah, we noticed particularly in Uganda, there are a couple of local initiatives emerged to respond to the psychological and local legal needs. However, they are also, these young women reported that they're not enough, and they haven't reached women in refugee camps in Uganda. They're mostly focused in urban areas. Similar initiatives also emerge in Egypt. However, we notice larger differences of these supports in other locations such as Chad and particularly West Kordofan. Women haven't accessed any support since their arrival to these, I would call them resettlement camps. Um, and there are many of them citing that they women, for instance, cited that she was pregnant and she had to walk for long hours. And since she arrived to that particular recent camp, she couldn't actually find any health support. Other older people also have particular diseases or regular diseases that they don't have access to medication. They don't have shelter and basic food items that they need for daily life.
That's super helpful, and I really appreciate you also pointing out specific gaps. Are there specific strategies? If you could say, copy this from here to somewhere else, what would be the kinds of things that you think are really having a positive impact and that we should be scaling up or replicating?
I believe supporting local initiatives because they are the most reliable or having more access to these areas, particularly conflict affected areas. People, particularly humanitarian organizations, are facing issues to access these locations physically because of the sometimes permits from authorities. Sometimes these armed groups block access, block roads that takes to these areas. So by funding local initiatives in these areas can actually support these communities to access health support and so on. Yeah.
Thanks. I think that's super important, and it's a perfect segue to the question I want to ask Maha. Maha, what do you see as the key challenges today in channeling resources effectively, filling gaps, and coordinating among donors in a time of incredible tumultuousness and pulling back?
Yeah, thank you so much, Carla, and thanks, Wala, for those insightful remarks. I think one of the most challenging issues is the international community is really is inadequately aware of the severity of the implications of the ongoing crisis in Sudan. In terms of the influx of refugees, displaced people, fragile border security, and then all these issues really increasing the spread of cross-border crimes, weapon trades, resource smuggling, transnational crimes, and so on. So those threats are very expandable to the Middle East and beyond. That lack of misunderstanding, that lack of understanding is also affect international donors' policy to prioritize funding for humanitarian and emergency response to address those gaps just Wala mentioned. So I think that's one of the really serious issues we are keep experiencing, really to ensure international community is aware of those implications. Now, if you look at the regional and local levels, the whole Horn of Africa and East Africa is experiencing a local governance and accountability issue. Public corruption and fraudulent activities also discouraging funding agencies' operation. And this is also impacting monitoring aid delivery to ensure it reaches to the vulnerable populations. If you went at the very local level on Sudan borders and refugees camps, there are several issues of accessibility and logistical coordination issues. This is also coupled with the social and operational restrictions that really put a lot of burden on women-led and community-based organizations to deliver locally and contextually informed support. The last thing is also, I think, the heavy compliance requirement by funding agencies. Always international funding agencies bypasses the local capacities. So this is really create a challenge on local organizations and local actors to provide coordinated and equitable accessibility and monitoring of distribution of humanitarian assistance and provision of contextually informed solutions. So yeah, the compliance is always an issue.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate you bringing to light the regional dimensions and the regional implications associated with this conflict, because I think, there's both a lack of awareness of the humanitarian crisis and its implications for an enormous number of people who are complete innocents, and as well implications for spillover that are already undermining local governance and local stability. And I think that's just a super important spotlight to shine. Given what you're saying, Maha, I wonder, how would you advise international actors to ensure that their funding strategies are responsive both at local levels and bear in mind these cross-border considerations and the spillover effects?
Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to comment on what Wala mentioned. In Georgetown Institute, really, we are trying to prioritize supporting trauma and psychological issues through extended list of local partners in Uganda and in conflict zones in Kordofan and in Darfur. But still, that cannot stand as like a very one effort. It really needs to be supported by additional initiatives. So I think to address the gaps that just Wala described, I would say international actors should move from reactive to anticipatory funding models. My point is, what Wala mentioned is not a secondary issue. It is a very structural driver of vulnerability that really needed to be treated as a core pillar of emergency response. So that means we really need to dedicate flexible multi-year funding to women-led organizations, to refugee-led initiatives, particularly those initiatives working on trauma, on gender-based violence, and also on human rights violations. Then I think the funding strategies must really account on regional and security dynamics. So international community underestimate how Sudan displacement crisis is really reshaping the whole regional crisis. Now, as I mentioned, we see rising of transitional crimes, arms smuggling, erosion of community cohesion. So if these threats continue to be under addressed, this will really destabilize the East Africa and Middle East. So that risk is being factored by funding priorities. So we really need to work on research. I would say I'm always encouraging people to work on research to inform their policies, to prioritize funding, to stabilize the issue in East Africa so that all these implications are not transferred to other regions. The third issue, I think we really need to work on the accessibility and compliance. They must be redesigned. They must be contextually informed by the local barriers. As I mentioned, there are too many security and regional barriers. They really need to be taken into consideration when international organizations planning funding for humanitarian or for emergency response. And also, I think that's the moment where we really international donors need to listen to community-based organizations, to women-led organizations, to understand their capacities, where they can really support operations, where they cannot, so that you build their capacities to improve their compliance, to have a very sustained local actors who can really take care of that fund. I think my last point is going to be we really need to regionally harmonize the donor coordination. There is a lack of coordination between donors. We see UN agencies trying to provide humanitarian support through UNHCR, WFP, UNICEF, and so on, but still those efforts are kind of scattered. We really need to coordinate those issues. We really need to also to ensure the inclusion of the accessibility of those efforts to most vulnerable people. We really also need to work on international monitoring mechanisms, because also in our work in Sudan, monitoring the distribution of humanitarian assistance, we documented too many corruption activities by public authorities, and in many cases, there are some accusations of involvement of some international actors on those fraudulent activities. So we really need to build the capacities of also local actors to monitor the distribution of the humanitarian assistance.
Thanks. That's a really wonderful, specific list of ways to move an agenda forward. And I really appreciate that sort of action-oriented response. We've had tremendous disruption in the system over the last few months, right? Withdrawals of funding, abrupt stoppage of programs. We see a declining aid environment. How does your thinking evolve as a result of that disruption? And I would pose that question to both of you, because I think you look at this in different ways, and we have a very different reality. So how has your head shifted as a result of those changes?
I think one of the key issues that we keep emphasizing on as a funding and a donor recipient funding organization, that the localization. I think that's the moment where we really need to ensure we have as much as we could stabilize localized mechanisms. Because localization will bring the realistic understanding of the context, and it will just reflect the facts for funding agencies. And I think also the past period also, the lesson that we learned is we really need to create like an inclusive, neutral platform where I think refugees' voices, host governments' priorities, and international community commitments can really intersect. What Wala has been mentioning on issues related to accessing to public services in Uganda, for instance, or in Kenya, it's an issue that international community and host government really sharing responsibility for. So we really need to have that neutral platform. I think the most effective approach is to launch kind of joint planning framework that really engages the refugee-led organizations, the Women Network as co-creators, not only as beneficiaries. And then this should be like a transformative experience that we continue to invest on to ensure that all our interventions, as I mentioned earlier, are contextually informed and relevant. So that approach could really ensure not only the localization, but also the empowerment of women, either in refugees camps or in diaspora or even inside Sudan. I think one of the success that we saw in the past period is when humanitarian development and peace nexus is actively interconnected, you can have a very multiplied impact. So we really need to shift our thought on when it comes to humanitarian is not just like life-saving aid, but it has a component of stability, resilience, and those are essential requirements to transform or to shift from being fragile to be resilient and then to start to proactively react to the crisis. So we really need to consider that triangle: development, peace, and humanitarian. Because that way you can integrate national development agendas. For instance, you can integrate health, education, local governance improvement, aligning funding policies. You can also ensure that the community ownership become very easier, which is that really create the lasting impact. Yeah.
Thanks. I really appreciate that. Wala, are there priorities given the sort of the disruption that you would place the spotlight on particularly?
Yeah, as I mentioned, protection. Women in conflict zones particularly need to be protected from the violence incited by different armed groups. Also, access to health, because many of them are struggling with developed health conditions after the war or after displacement. And unfortunately, they don't have access to that. I would say also among the other priorities is that these young women provided with access to education. Uh, Majority of them have been in different education levels before the war, and currently because also the lack of infrastructure or also the financial barriers holding them back from accessing educational settings, particularly in Chad. Financial barriers cited among the majority of them. In West Kordofan, there are actually no educational infrastructure available in their resettlement camps. Even in Egypt and Uganda, they're struggling with financial barriers. But particularly Uganda, they also mentioned how the language is also a barrier for them to continue their education. And also because of many of them lost their access to previous certificates, they're not able to enroll in or integrate in another education systems in their countries, in their displaced countries. So these among the priorities that the international community can advocate for, particularly for them also accessing scholarships. They cited the majority of universities ask them about their previous education records and certificates, and also because universities in Sudan have their infrastructure damaged or destroyed, they are not able to issue new certificates or to validate sometimes. Yeah, so I would say these among their recommendations.
Thanks. Those are super helpful. I want to switch gears before opening it up for some questions that folks have submitted before and today. Last areas around these digital tools. You both have touched on the need to raise awareness and both of the situation of women refugees, as well as awareness of the conflict and its implications writ large. From your different vantage points, and I really appreciate the different perspectives you're bringing to this conversation, how can we and how are we leveraging digital tools for good? How are we able to amplify refugee voices? How are we better able to focus attention? How should we be using these tools in an opportunistic way to help push for a resolution of the crisis and the conflict? Maybe Maha, we'll hear from you first, and then I'll turn back to you, Wala.
Yeah, thank you. I think digital media is really a significant issue in Sudan, and it's one of the root causes for fueling the conflict. We really need to understand, first of all, how conflicting parties are relying on digital media as a tool really to create hate speech, to divide community, to increase polarization among civilians and increase the hate among different and ethnic groups. So that mechanism, we really need to understand it. I would encourage all actors who are interested in supporting Sudan to dig into understanding how those conflicting parties are devoting resources, bringing manpower, bringing technologies from authoritarian countries to intensify censorship, to crack down on civic space, to detain people by tracking their social media accounts. So it became a very security threat for everyone. But still, when you look at communities in diaspora, communities in refugees areas, it's always good to have a very established digital platform for coordination. I would always encourage women groups and other civil society groups to have that platform established to ensure that it has a very good encryption and security measures in place to avoid attacks from, conflicting parties, censorship tools, and so on. So that platform could really scale outreach to build transnational solidarity, to enable Sudanese women to lead beyond borders, and also to document what continue to happen. We are looking ahead for transitional justice, for accountability. The digital media could really play that role to document for future accountability and access to justice. We also need to build the capacities. Most of Sudanese civil society groups, they are really not very well mastering dealing with digital technology. So we really need to build those capacities. We really need to stabilize like a continuous learning process to advance their interaction with technology and media. I will stop here and I pass it over to Wala.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate you raising this issue of the asymmetries also in terms of the nefarious actors versus those who are promoting peace and well-being and education, as Wala mentioned. Wala, what would you share?
Thank you. I can't agree more with Maha. However, I also want to shed the light on how these armed groups are also destroying the telecom infrastructure, which affecting access to internet and digital tools by various humanitarian actors as well on the ground. Civil emergency response groups emerge to respond to the humanitarian crisis in their communities. However, they cannot access the internet because of the telecom blackout, I mean. And although these telecom companies reestablished their centers again in Port Sudan, which is now a self-controlled area, is still the other locations are not really accessing the internet, particularly the western regions such as Darfur and Kordofan. And I also want to mention how these groups are particularly targeted with disinformation or harmful information in general. They are facing a lot of security issues on the ground. And I want to touch about also how women are sometimes targeted with online gender-based violence to deter them from taking a political stance or to be part of the peace process. And sometimes because of them being supporting one side or not the other. So I would say the harmful information really polarized the communities. Um, we need also to advocate for social media companies to respond to reports by local communities about harmful information. We need them to be more responsive and more fast to respond to these harmful narratives disseminated on social media so that at least we can kind of decrease the impact it has on the ground and the impact of violence that sometimes it contributes to.
Thank you. I appreciate both you shining a spotlight on the lack of accessibility. Sometimes people can assume that everybody just has access to these tools, as well as the terrible growing issue of technology-facilitated gender-based violence, which is an increasing threat, and we already see women pulling back from public spaces as a result of the violence the threats and violence they face online, with reductions in women running for public office, for example, in places like Nigeria and elsewhere, as a result of the vitriol that they are seeing, and so it's a multidimensional issue, digital communication, and how we move that agenda forward. With that, I want to turn to some of the questions and comments from people who are online, and many of those, we got a flood of questions in advance as well. I will ask my colleague Jihan to identify some of those questions that we want to focus on as well.
Yes, thank you, Carla. Well, we have received some really interesting questions from our audience. I would begin by a question on the most immediate intervention that the international community can offer to Sudanese women. Both Wala and Maha, they addressed the challenges, the gaps, maybe the best funding approaches, but what would be the most immediate and pressing call to action that the international community can embrace to support Sudanese women at the moment?
I can start it off. I think, given our current work in Sudan, one of the successful initiatives that we see is a building localized income generation activities, particularly for internal displacement zones, quote unquote, areas either controlled by SAF or RSF. So we have been trying to channel accessibility of a small stipend of cash for emergency response, particularly for women, given the fact that women now are caregivers to minors and senior people. They are just vulnerable without access to any resources. It has been a very challenging experience in terms of identifying cash transfer mechanisms, given the compliance requirements of donors, but we were able to identify a way. So I would really recommend to addressing issues of how we can really generate, we can support income generation activities for women, supporting cash accessibility to those women. And also, I think we are also established like a safe space for women. Particularly, we used to have a project on documenting the impact of human rights violations for future accountability. And women always, as Wala mentioned, are intimidated by norms, by security, by too many operational capacities. So we established a safe space space to document for women sexual violation and so on. And I would encourage the continuation of the establishment of those safe spaces to document, to give women the space to heal up, to receive trauma support so that they can stay resilient. So those are the most, we see those are like successful interventions now we are doing in Sudan.
Thank you very much, Maha, for that comprehensive response. We have another question on ways to improve relationships between Sudanese refugees in Eastern Chad. This is like a very specific question. In Eastern Chad and local Chadian communities. Wala, do you have any thoughts on how to improve the relationships between the Sudanese refugees and the local communities in the eastern part of Chad?
Yeah, that's actually a very important question because how women are actually also reported being discriminated against, reported the constant threats in public transport or public spaces. So these are indicators that these displaced communities, the Sudanese displaced communities and Chadian communities are not well integrated. And that shed light about the importance of creating activities, raising awareness about, for instance, using community behavior change or peaceful coexistence between these two communities. And it's very important, particularly at this point, to ensure also the safety of refugees in this location. Yeah.
Thank you for that. We have another interesting question that is simply asking, what does life look like now for Sudanese students? So maybe Wala or you, Maha, if you could give us a glimpse on the living conditions of Sudanese students or Sudanese youth in general, especially women and young girls. What does like daily life look like to them?
I can answer part of that, and you're welcome, Maha, also to add if you need to. Particularly young girls, they were at some level, they were at some educational level before the war. And as I mentioned, the majority of them are not able to continue their education because of financial barriers. Others are not able to continue their education because loss of their certificates or records at universities. Sudanese universities, however, try to shift towards e-learning or distance learning module. However, this is not very efficient and not very accessible, particularly for girls who are now in refugee camps and they don't have access to digital devices and they don't have access to the internet. And the Sudanese universities also increased their fees, their administration or admission fees, which makes it also very challenging for these women to continue their education, their higher education. However, also women in the western regions, particularly Darfur and West Kordofan, even at high school or primary schools, they're not able to continue their education because of the impact of the conflict on the education infrastructure, the displacement of the teaching staffs themselves, the occupation of schools by displaced communities seeking shelter from shillings and conflict in other areas. So that's particularly concerning now, even for young and for young women. Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in with one question because I think you sort of alluded to it while in your answer. There's an incredible history of women's leadership in Sudan. Women led the demonstrations that led to the fall of the former dictator. They have long history of education in the country. Just many, many female ministers in your history, and I'm wondering, how do we bring forward these incredible leaders at a time when we don't see Sudanese women leaders being brought forward on a regular basis? How do we re-energize those voices and bring them into, recenter them in these discussions?
I think they are generally burned out. Women are generally burned out because how we shifted from ousting the farmer regime, revolution, transitional government, and then suddenly the war. Women are currently are leading, but however, more in local context. They're more focused on responding to local needs, to their family needs as well, because also how the war has affected them. So these women need particular spaces, such as these spaces, to come and speak about the challenges they face. Um, to be better, to having a better platform to organize again, to have roundtable discussions, to come up with policies that they can see best respond to their needs at this moment, and to be part of any upcoming peace negotiation efforts, because they have experienced different violence. They have experienced different responsibilities now, so they need to be part of this also, for in order to ensure that future peace would sustain, and that justice will follow as well.
I would just add to that when it comes to the role of women in future peace processes. I think we really need to revise the previous engagement of women groups in previous peace negotiations to understand the success and the failures. We need to revise the modalities for women participation in localized peace and community resilient initiatives so that we can just improve the traditional perception against women, and I think also we need to continue really working on those safe spaces, I would say, and importantly, all those steps cannot be undertaken unless we are having protection of civilian mechanism in place. The protection of civilian could be really integrating some women peace and security agenda. At this moment, we see that the system is not functioning. We cannot rely on public institutions to support any further actions on the Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan or so. So that's why protection of civilian is a must. And that's where women could really ensure that they have a space to feel safe. And most importantly, which is something that we continue to advocate for international allies, is supporting regional government and governments of hosting governments to find a way to identify a dignified legal status for people. That's not only for women, but it's for all Sudanese in refugee status. They really need to have a dignified legal status so that they can work, they can reintegrate in the community. And this, you can imagine the impact of this on women who are like the most vulnerable group within the entire population of refugees. So it's also maybe a moment to call on considering some regional or international talks to support host governments to really address the issues of legal residency, dignified work permits, authorization, and access to education and health services in countries of refuge. This is essential also for women.
Thank you, Maha and Wala, for sharing these very insightful thoughts and ideas. We have a question about practical projects that are working for women now in Sudan and how they can be replicated. Are there any successful examples that you would like to highlight that give us a glimmer of hope and that can be replicated to address all these concerns that we have mentioned today?
I think, yeah, we need to continue on expansion of safe spaces for women to provide them with trauma support and to document the violence that they're exposed to since the eruption of the conflict. We need to provide them with tools to develop some income generation opportunities. We also need to stabilize a localized or a bottom-up platform so that women they can come together and speak. I think if women get the courage to speak of their experience, that will increase the resilience, which is something that we really need to invest on. And in the meantime, we also need to revise the role of women groups in peace process, in ceasefire, in establishment of humanitarian corridors. If a ceasefire agreement is reached, we really need to understand how women can support those initiatives. And we also need to think of the role of women in security sector reform in future. There's also like a very early discussions that we are now engaged in customizing some research tool to understand how women can support future security reform. So I think, yeah, these are the current initiatives that could continue to be supported if there are funding opportunities.
Thank you, Maha, for that. We have a question also on a very important angle, which is the health risks that women face. Are the gender inequalities that women are facing putting them at increased risk of contracting infectious diseases? So maybe Maha or Wala, if you could shine a light also on that dimension, the health risks and the health consequences that women are confronting due to the lack of support. If you could briefly touch on that, I think that would be very important.
Yeah, I can add to that briefly, particularly about the story of a SGB survivor in Chad. She mentioned that she lacked access to STDs. She lacked access to specialized um, experts, particularly she had her hand was broken and her ribs were broken as well. So she said there are general lack of access to examination laboratories. There are no enough medications. There are general slow time to access routine healthcare. So of course, in such displaced communities, we need to accelerate the response, particular for these cases. Um, However, other women also they mentioned that they access health opportunities or health services, yet it's not very regular. And I believe there are mobile health clinics, but they're not able to reach the whole camp and respond to the whole camp needs. So we need to accelerate the response to provide sufficient funds for these communities, particularly those who faced atrocities and severe violence in West Kordofan and fled to Chad border. Yeah.
Thank you, Annette, for that. I think we might have time for one final question that maybe Maha can address to kind of like wrap up this conversation. How can the women, peace and security agenda in particular be used and implemented to make sure that Sudanese women are not left behind?
I think that will be like basically contingent of on the international regional actors' will, because women, peace and security agenda has a lot of national implications and commitments. And now, with a dysfunctioning system, we really need to have external power to really to guard and to monitor maybe revision of the current agenda for women in Sudan, maybe to kind of customize some of the agenda into interim interventions and activities. We also need to have a dialogue with women to hear their voices, to ensure the validity of the agenda. It's just everything is really changing, and we are assuming the predefined agenda, which is the whole context is now changed, and I think it's also has to do with the willingness of regional and international community to set a robust peace process. Now, the whole thing, we cannot, I mean, we are speaking about humanitarian support. We're speaking about initiative to support women in refugees, in refugees camps, in the borders, in Chad, inside Sudan, outside. But all this is kind of ad hoc solutions. It's not gonna bring a durable support to ensure women are really stabilized and secured. So we really need to have a very genuine and transparent discussion on what agenda do we need to bring for a peace process, how we can really bring conflicting parties to a ceasefire, how we can ensure engagement of women in the implementation of any agreement, operationalization of any ceasefire agreement, ensure that they have a role in the beginning. And then speaking about documentation for transitional justice, we need to identify the women role as early as possible. So it's a very integrated and entangled process. We cannot exclude part of it and try to focus on the other. It's all has to do, to be honest, with the international community's willingness to understand the role of regional countries, interests, Malayan actors who are really intervening to sabotage the situation in Sudan, understanding the interest of the regional and neighboring countries in Sudan, what benefits they get from having the continuation of the conflict versus the stability. We really need to put guarantees. I mean, we saw the previous Jeddah, Geneva platforms, they failed to bring a durable ceasefire. So we really need to revisit that. What really didn't work, we need to, I mean, we all know, we know the elephant in the room. So we really need to have that transparent discussion. So again and again, I would say women, peace and security agenda, women participation in peace process, all those are very cross-cutting issues, and they cannot be effectively addressed without a peace process.
Thank you.
And with that, thank you very much. Back to you, Carla.
Thanks. Very compelling final case, Maha. Wala, with our final moments, I want to return us to the voice of these women that you've been interviewing and speaking with, who are displaced and directly affected by the conflict. What would their message be based on your primary research and interviews, and what would you say to this audience of people who can influence international discourse and the conversation moving forward?
Thanks, Carla, for this question. I want to actually amplify the voices of these women, particularly when it comes to accessing livelihood opportunities or any humanitarian assistance in West Kordofan, particularly in Chad, but also in Egypt and Uganda. The majority of these women used to depend on one of their caregivers for livelihood. However, as we know, because of the war and displacement, there were immense loss of these livelihoods, and currently they work on very exploitative environments. So we need them to have fair access to job opportunities. But I can't agree more with Maha about this is an ad hoc solution. We need actually to stop the war, because that would ensure at least a couple of these people can even go back to their homes, or they can access the education infrastructure they have in their region, So the real efforts that needs to be taken beside providing protection and livelihoods for these women, we need the international community really to move and to bring the two armed or the two warring parties into ceasefire and negotiate to end this war. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just really wanted to quickly comment on the question on the chat on why funding is important right now in Sudan, and the fact that Sudan has been receiving fund for decades and nothing is being changed. Now, currently we're speaking about the highest refugees displacement percentage all over the world. We are speaking about the death of hundreds of thousands of people. We are speaking about the utilization of different human rights and torture tools, starvation, child recruitment for rebel movements. We are speaking about roughly 50,000 of enforced disappearance people in Sudan. We are speaking about fragility and security borders of more than 7 countries across East Africa. We are speaking about spread of disease, spread of absence of access to education for people. We are speaking of lack of access to public services. So it's, I mean, for all these reasons, funding is important, and the fact that people continues to support Sudan for decades. This is what I have been talking about: the lack of the political willingness to really find a durable solution to Sudan. Humanitarian agencies, UN mechanisms continue to support Sudan to save lives, to stabilize people access to public service, but that's not enough unless we have a genuine, durable solution for Sudan, the political process, the peace process. We saw that in South Sudan, it ended up with a secession and then outbreak of conflict, and again, highest displacement of brothers and sisters in South Sudan. And now the situation is repeating itself, which is just demonstrates the failure of previous mechanisms to really fix the issue in Sudan. So that's why we really need to find that solution to ensure that funding is being really effectively utilized.
Thank you, Maha and Wala, for that important call to action. And, you know, I think that your focus on how we localize, how we better coordinate, how we drive towards a durable solution that tackles root causes and delivers for the people of Sudan is incredibly important. I want to thank you, the GIWPS team, and all of those who attended our conversation this morning. I think you'll agree that it was incredibly important, powerful, and full of substance and actionable recommendations for the future. Thank you for being with us this morning, and have a good day or a good evening wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.